Hello, my name is Erin Moffatt, and I'll be presenting to you today a case study on the present and colonial state of the Aboriginal Child Welfare System within Canada. On July 7, 2016, the British Columbia Detachment of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police ordered the evacuation of the Tillawash First Nation community due to the threat of forest fires. This all being reported by the Vancouver Star. Chief Joe Alphonse refused to evacuate as the community decided to fight the fires themselves. The RCMP then threatened to remove all the children forcibly if the community did not obey the orders. There have been many historical events in Canada's past and many laws that continue to oppress Aboriginal people, and this article highlights their struggle to forge their way away from these colonial powers. I will continue to discuss many of these issues in the following slides. Canada has produced numerous laws which have sought to restrain Aboriginal children from growing up enriched in their own culture. The most well-known case of this is the residential schools, which were open in Canada for nearly 100 years. In the context of the Tillawash First Nation community and their conflict with the RCMP, there are some important historical contexts to note. In 1920, the Indian Act 10A, now amended, allowed any officer to go in a home where the child was of school age and they could remove the children. This did not only help fuel the residential school system, but also gave the RCMP the right to go into any community and remove the child. In the 1950s, the federal government added changes to the Indian Act, allowing public services to extend onto reserves. This includes children's aid services. This meant that the children's aid services, such as foster care homes, can be placed on reserves even though they may not reflect the community's views. This started an era called the 60s scoop, where many children were being taken out of their home and put into the reserves. As the article mentions, the chief and the community members had decided it would be best for them to stay in the reserves and fight fires themselves. This was an act of self-governance. Although the RCMP threatened to remove the children of the reserve, the community resisted because of their mutual understanding of the risk. They are continuing to make decisions on how to handle the forest fires themselves, including investing $150,000 of their own money into forest fires, as well as training 400 firefighters. The RCMP's actions to show that they did not understand the methodologies and the values of the Tillawash First Nation community. Within the Aboriginal community, decisions are made by all community members and are affirmed in a positive law-creating process. They understand child care and the responsibility of the whole community, not just the parents' duty. When these two different practices are forced to work together, they often clash. Currently, the Child Welfare for Indigenous people living on reserve is funded by the government. This gives the lone responsibility of child welfare to the province and territory, not the Aboriginal community. By default, in British Columbia, when the First Nation community has not been delegated any child welfare service provider, the Ministry of Children and Family Development becomes in control. Directive 21, created in the 1990s, is a step to help create child welfare system which gives more responsibility to the Aboriginal communities and makes it more culturally relevant child welfare service. However, this directive was never fully equipped to better the child welfare services because of lack of funding due to equality, and did not address many of the multi-generational problems that lie within the communities. Today, the provincial government has a right to remove any children from the reserve if they are being neglected according to provincial standards. The removal of children from their homes creates a society which has to deal with many problems. When placed outside their own community into another, children face an identity crisis that results in long-term psychological patterns such as anxiety, depression, or addictions. The figure on the right of the screen is by Statistics Canada, and it highlights how mental or substance abuse disorders are persistent in Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities. It shows how many Aboriginal communities suffer from mental disorders and substance disorders more permanently than non-Aboriginal communities. Neglect is often a word that has many different definitions. Many times, children are removed from the home even though the neglect is not being fully understood. One could ask the question, why is the neglect happening in the first place? Many researchers believe that this is a cyclical process. This meant that the parents have undergone trauma, so they begin to neglect their children, and as a result, these children begin to suffer, and their mental health is then put at risk. Once a child grows into adults, they begin to neglect their children, creating intergenerational patterns of family behavior. The past colonial actions of the Canadian government have caused much trauma for Aboriginal people, and this is continuing today. As a whole, Aboriginal people are going to suffer because of the historical and present neglect that is happening. This jeopardizes the mental health of the parents and of the children. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has made many calls to action upon the review of the child welfare system within Canada. To highlight a few major calls to action which would help improve child welfare on reserves, especially within the Tillawaras First Nation community, are under Section 1, to call all parties involved, provincial government, federal, and Aboriginal communities, to reduce the number of children within the child welfare system by ensuring that social workers and others who conduct child welfare investigations are properly educated and trained about the potential for Aboriginal communities and families to provide more appropriate solutions to family healing. This will help reduce the threats and children in the child welfare system. Under Section 4, Part 1, affirm the right of Aboriginal governments to establish and maintain their own child welfare agencies. Truth and Reconciliation continues to promote these calls to actions. However, the recommendations made by the TERC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, will help improve Aboriginal child welfare on and off reserve. It'll be interesting to see how the government will start making these recommendations. In 2008, the United Nations created a Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to encompass many nations all over the world where Indigenous people have been mistreated under settler colonial state. Under the United Nations Declaration for the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is Article 7, Section 2, which gives Indigenous people the right to live in freedom, peace, security as distinct people, and shall not be subject to any act of genocide or any other act of violence, including forcibly removing children from one group into another. Because this is not a Canadian government policy, it does not hold any legal value to the Canadian system, but rather it creates an environment in which many other nation states are calling upon Canada and looking at their horrible actions, along with Australia, New Zealand, the United States of America, to see how they will change their Indigenous policies. As the article states, they are currently having conversations on how to rebuild the relationship and work together in the upcoming forest fire season so that both the RCMP and the Tillawaras First Nation community reach an agreement. To help improve Canada's existing Indigenous law policies, they should work together to incorporate Indigenous narratives and ideologies that govern Indigenous communities. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports that the current Aboriginal child welfare policies are a product of past colonial policies that governed the residential school system, and there needs to be a reform put in place. The Child and Family Services Act Review 2015 did not provide the courts with enough traditional knowledge to help them decide what is in the best interest of the child in regards to helping preserve the Indigenous knowledge and communities. In Ontario, the recent Bill 89 has been passed, which enables band members to represent the children. It also provides a better framework to ensure that the child is properly connected to their heritage and traditions while growing up. The next two slides are my references that I used for this presentation. I would like to thank you for listening to this presentation on Aboriginal child welfare system within Canada. Have a great day.